71 colonies, one summer. Every one of them had passed a June inspection that, by any standard reading of the time, should have predicted a strong season ahead. Full populations, active foragers, brood wall to wall across 8-9 frames. Heavy boxes. The colonies were doing exactly what healthy colonies are supposed to do in June, and the beekeeper who owned them had every reason to walk away from those inspections satisfied. By September, they were gone. Not weakened, not struggling. Gone. The man who kept those records in Ohio in the summer of 1929 was not a careless beekeeper. He had been managing commercial colonies for more than 15 years. He knew what a sick hive looked like. He had seen disease. He had seen starvation. He had seen queen failure spread through an apiary before he could respond to it. And none of those explanations fit what happened that summer, because none of the signs were there in June. He documented every loss. He wrote down what each colony had looked like in its last inspection before the collapse. And what he found in those records was the thing that kept him writing for the next 10 years. He could not find a single indicator that should have predicted it. That is the part worth sitting with. Not that 71 colonies died. Colonies die. That is the nature of this work, and anyone managing bees at scale in 1929 understood that. What he couldn't reconcile was that every standard measure of colony health had pointed in the same direction in June, and every one of those colonies was dead before the goldenrod opened in August. He spent a decade trying to understand why his June inspections had told him nothing useful about what was coming. What he eventually wrote down was not a treatment. It was not a product or a protocol in the commercial sense. It was a question, one question, asked at the right time, that none of his June inspections had been structured to ask. We'll get to what that question was, but first it's worth understanding exactly what a June inspection was measuring in 1929, and why those measurements were simultaneously accurate and completely useless. June inspection in the Ohio commercial tradition of that era followed a sequence any experienced beekeeper would recognize. Population coverage across the frames. Brood pattern. Was the queen laying solidly through the center frames with a normal distribution of eggs, open larvae and capped cells? Forager activity at the entrance. Store depth in the frames surrounding the brood nest. 4 criteria. Observable, reproducible and clear. The colony that passed all 4 was cleared for the season. All 71 colonies passed. Here is what those 4 criteria were actually measuring. Population coverage told him how many bees were in the hive on the day he opened it. Brood pattern told him what the queen had been doing over the previous 3 weeks, because the capped brood he was looking at had been laid 21 days before he arrived. Forager activity told him whether the clover flow was still moving, and whether the colony's oldest workers were still operating. Store depth told him what had accumulated over the past several weeks. Every one of those 4 measurements was looking backward. Every one of them described the colony's recent past. Not one of them said anything about what would happen 6 weeks from now, when the summer nectar gap arrived and everything that June inspection had measured began to matter in a different way. If this kind of backward-looking diagnostic failure, the way inspection structure can give you perfect information about the wrong question, is the kind of thing that changes how you work your hives. A like on this video helps this channel reach other beekeepers who think this way, and if you've had a June that looked like success and an August that didn't match it, I'd be interested in what you found. Leave it below. To understand what June inspection cannot show, it's necessary to understand what happens to a large, healthy colony when the nectar flow ends. And in Ohio, it ends. Not in fall. Not in late summer. It ends, in most years, in the 3rd or 4th week of June, when the white clover finishes and before the late goldenrod and aster sources open in August. There is a gap, a genuine nectar gap that runs 4 to 6 weeks across most Ohio summers. It has been there as long as commercial beekeeping has operated in that region. Most years you can count on it. Some years it's shorter, but it comes. During the clover flow, a large colony with 60,000 bees or more is an efficient system. Foragers bring in nectar. House bees process and dehydrate it. The population sustains itself through continuous incoming nutrition. The queen maintains peak output. The brood nest turns over every 3 weeks with fresh workers. The system is in equilibrium. The moment the flow ends, that equilibrium shifts. And here's where it turns against what most beekeepers expect. The colony that looks strongest in June, maximum population, full brood, heavy boxes, is carrying the highest metabolic load into the dearth. A colony of 60,000 bees with active brood rearing consumes somewhere between 2 and 3 pounds of stored honey every single day during a dearth. Not during the flow, when incoming nectar offsets that number. After the flow stops. Every day of the nectar gap, that large population draws down the reserves it built during the clover weeks. The foragers, who had sustained themselves and the colony through daily intake, become net consumers rather than net producers the moment they stop coming back with nectar. A colony of 30,000 bees consumes roughly half that daily volume. It enters the same dearth with the same number of days to survive. But the arithmetic is different. The large colony isn't stronger during the dearth, it's more expensive. The beekeeper inspecting his best colonies in June, the ones with the most bees, the best brood, the most active entrants, was looking at the colonies with the least dearth resilience per pound of stored food. Size is not stability. That sentence deserves to sit for a moment. A bigger population in June is a bigger liability the moment the income stops. But consumption alone doesn't explain 71 dead colonies. A beekeeper could feed, could supplement, could recognize a colony burning through stores and intervene. The consumption math matters, but isn't the whole story. What made those colonies particularly vulnerable was not just how many bees they carried in June. It was how old those bees were, and what the queen was about to do. Most beekeepers stop looking right here. It is exactly where the problem was. A worker bee in summer lives roughly 6 weeks from egg to natural death. 3 weeks developing inside the cell, 3 to 4 weeks as an adult, first as a house bee tending brood, then as a forager carrying pollen and nectar. The foragers visible at the entrance during a June inspection, those older, darker bees with worn wing edges, working the clover hard, were bees that had hatched in late April or early May. They were already in the latter half of their foraging life. Within 3 to 4 weeks of that June inspection, they would be dead, regardless of what happened with the nectar flow. That is simply what summer foragers do. What replaced them was still in the brood nest on inspection day. Eggs laid in late May, larvae in various stages, capped pupae approaching emergence. Those bees would emerge over the following 2 weeks, spend another 3 weeks as house bees before transitioning to foragers, and reach the entrance in late July, just as the dearth deepened. The colony the beekeeper inspected in June was at the peak of one forager generation and at the beginning of a transition to the next. The inspection saw the peak. What it could not see was that the peak was already the trailing edge. And then there was the queen. He spent 3 years looking at the wrong thing. He went back through every record, looking for disease patterns, colony weight data, evidence of robbing pressure, anything that distinguished the 71 colonies that died from the colonies in the same apiary that survived. He found partial patterns in some of those areas, nothing clean, nothing that held across all 71. Then, in the 3rd year, he began recording queen history alongside the lost data, and a pattern emerged clearly enough that he couldn't set it aside. The queens in the colonies that failed were on average older. Not uniformly, there were exceptions in both directions, but the tendency was consistent enough to document. Most of the queens presiding over those collapsed colonies were in their 2nd or 3rd season. Most of the queens in the surviving colonies had been introduced or raised within the previous 12 months. The reason this matters is not immediately obvious if you're accustomed to thinking about queen age primarily in terms of laying rate. A 2nd-year queen in May and June often lays as well as a 1st-year queen. Her brood pattern can be solid. Her colony's population may equal or exceed a colony headed by a younger queen. A June inspection would show no meaningful difference between them, but a queen in her second or third year responds to summer heat, dearth conditions, and the biological cues for reduced brood rearing differently than a young one. When nutritional income drops, when day length shortens, when pollen diversity narrows, signals the queen reads constantly through her attendant workers. Her output doesn't just slow, it slows faster and recovers more slowly. The older queens in those 71 colonies reduced laying sharply when the dearth arrived. Not abnormally for their age, not in a way that would have flagged as a problem in any inspection, but the combination of an already aging forager cohort, maximum daily consumption during dearth, and a queen whose response to stress was to cut her output substantially. Those three things together created a demographic collapse that unfolded across 6 weeks without a visible symptom until it was too late to interrupt. The strongest colonies in June were the most exposed in July. That is not a paradox. That is the biology. Here is the full sequence, laid out straight. The colony enters June at peak population. Large, active, well-provisioned. Every standard criterion pointing toward a strong season. The clover flow ends in the 3rd week of June. Stored consumption begins at maximum rate. The oldest foragers, the ones the June inspection saw working hard at the entrance, start dying and are not immediately replaced because the incoming cohort is still completing development in the brood nest. The queen, a second-year queen reading the nutritional decline the way queens do, reduces her laying rate. This is normal behavior. It is appropriate to the conditions she is reading. But the laying reduction means the next forager cohort, the one that should carry the colony into August, will be smaller than the current one. And the current one is already aging out. 6 weeks after that reduced laying, when those bees would have been foragers, there are not enough of them. The colony's population drops below the threshold needed to maintain normal function, temperature management, brood care, food processing. The colony does not fail all at once. It contracts, slowly at first, then faster, because each contraction reduces the colony's capacity to compensate for the next one. By September, what had been 60,000 bees in June is gone. If you've ever come back in August to a hive that should have been heavy and found it quiet, found the boxes lighter than they had any right to be, that is the sequence. Not a disease, not a robbery event. A cascade of entirely normal biology, poorly positioned against a predictable seasonal window, in a colony that the June inspection had every reason to clear as healthy. The thing that eventually changed his inspection practice was recognizing that June inspection confirmed the past. He needed something that looked forward, not at what the colony had produced, at what summer was about to demand from it. What he wrote down, after 10 years and whatever records he accumulated across those seasons, came down to 3 observations that a standard June inspection was not structured to capture. The first was queen vintage. Not just is she laying well, but how long has she been laying? A colony cleared on brood pattern alone, with no knowledge of when the queen was introduced, was being assessed on her current performance without any accounting for how that performance would shift under summer stress. He began keeping queen introduction dates across all his colonies and treating that record as a primary criterion in June assessment. A colony with a 2-year-old queen, however good her June brood looked, was flagged for observation through the dearth rather than simply cleared. The second observation was forager age profile. Not just are foragers active, but what do they look like? Foragers in the early weeks of their field career are lighter in colour, their wings undamaged, their abdominal colouring fresh. Foragers in the late weeks of their career are darker, worn, with frayed wing edges and visible abrasion. A June entrant showing predominantly old, worn foragers, even high-volume traffic, was a colony whose current forager generation was finishing, not starting. The replacement cohort was still inside the hive. That distinction was invisible to a standard entrance assessment. But once he knew to look for it, it predicted dearth vulnerability with enough consistency to be worth recording. The third observation was what he called brood slope, the ratio of eggs and young open larvae to capped brood across the central frames. A colony with wall-to-wall capped brood and relatively few eggs and open larvae looks impressive. It is producing a large number of emerging bees in the immediate 2-week window. But it also suggests that the queen's current laying rate may already be pulling back from peak, because the capped cells represent what she was doing 3 weeks ago, and the open cells represent what she is doing now. A colony with proportionally more open brood, more eggs and young larvae relative to capped pupae, indicates a queen still at or near peak output. A colony showing predominantly capped brood with sparse young larvae is a colony where the queen's peak is already behind her. The inspection is measuring the history of her best weeks, not her current trajectory. These 3 observations, queen vintage, forager age, brood slope, can be gathered in a single inspection without any additional equipment, any chemical analysis, any purchased input. They require the habit of looking at different things than the standard 4-criterion inspection was built to see, and that difference between measuring colony appearance and measuring colony trajectory is the gap that 71 records eventually made visible. That is what the decade of writing produced. Not a cure, not a treatment protocol, a different set of eyes at the same inspection, asking a different question at the same moment. The July deaths in 1929 were real losses, 71 colonies, and a decade of careful attention given to understanding them. The management habit that emerged from that attention didn't prevent every future loss. Nothing does. But the beekeepers who began adding those 3 observations to their June work reported fewer unexplained August collapses, not because they were doing something radically different inside the hives, but because they were predicting problems 6 weeks before those problems became visible, at the only moment when a prediction still has time to become a response. The biology of colony demographics has not changed since 1929. The summer dearth still arrives in Ohio in late June. Foragers still age and die on the same 6-week timeline from egg to spent field bee. Queens past their first season still respond to heat and dearth with reduced output at rates their younger counterparts don't match. The cascade from peak June appearance to August collapse still follows the same sequence, in the same order, driven by the same mechanisms. What changed was the industry's relationship to that sequence. Commercial beekeeping's mid-century expansion built itself around treatment and replacement. A colony that collapsed in August could be requeened, could be combined, could be restocked from packages in the spring following. The collapse became recoverable, and when collapse is recoverable, the incentive to predict it 6 weeks in advance, which requires a different kind of attention in June than the standard inspection provides, quietly diminishes. The 3 observations that came out of those 71 records require no product, no treatment schedule, no catalogue order. They require being in front of the right hive at the right time in June, looking at the right things for the right reason. What you measure in June tells you about April, not August. That was the thing he spent 10 years learning to say clearly, and it is still true. The question that June inspection needs to ask, not what has this colony produced, but what will this colony need, is still the question that most inspections are not structured to answer. Queen vintage, forager age, brood slope, 3 observations, 1 inspection, 6 weeks of lead time. The beekeeper in 1929 walked away from 71 strong hives in June and came back to 71 dead ones by September. The inspection didn't fail him because it was done wrong. It failed him because it was asking the right questions about the wrong season. He spent 10 years writing down the difference, so the next beekeeper who opened those frames in June might understand what they were actually looking at. If that kind of pre-failure attention, the kind that works 6 weeks before the problem shows up, changes how you think about your June work, subscribe. There is more in this direction, more questions worth asking earlier than most beekeepers think to ask them. And if you've been through a summer like this, strong in June, quiet in August, I'd genuinely like to know what you found when you went back through it. What was different about the colonies that made it? Leave it below. 71 records, 10 years of writing. One question asked 6 weeks too late, 71 times in a row, and eventually asked at the right moment for the rest of the seasons that followed. That is what the documentation was for.